This story isn't just a debate, it's a defining moment. In a country divided by headlines and humor, one woman walked into a room built on sweat and steel and stood her ground. Karoline Leavitt didn't come to entertain, she came to remind us who we are. If you're someone who still believes in loyalty, respect, and speaking up when it counts, this one's for you. The old Milltown Steelworks stood like a cathedral of American labor. Its beams rusted but proud, its brick walls weathered by decades of sweat and storms. Tonight, it wasn't molten iron that burned inside, but anticipation. The plant, long retired from production, had been transformed into a town hall venue, with rows of folding chairs lined up beneath faded banners and black and white photos of men in soot-covered overalls. The audience was mostly older, veterans, retired foremen, former union men, faces lined with time, hands still calloused from work they no longer did but never forgot. The air carried the scent of oil and old steel, and the silence before the cameras rolled felt almost sacred. A flag hung above the main platform not just as decor but as a quiet witness. Here respect wasn't demanded, it was earned, and the woman about to take the stage knew it. Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in history, was stepping into a space not built for politicians or celebrities, but for builders, fighters, and survivors. There would be no studio applause, no laugh tracks, only truth and tension. Outside, a cold wind whispered through the broken windows of the old administrative office. Inside, the audience waited, not for a show, but for a reckoning. Because in this steel-boned hall, people didn't care about memes or trending tweets. They cared about jobs, dignity, and whether someone standing at that podium understood the price of a mortgage missed or a factory light turned off forever. And when the lights flickered on, there was no roar, just the stillness of men who had seen too much to be impressed, but who still hoped, quietly, to be heard. The stage was set, not for spectacle, but for truth. When Karoline Leavitt stepped through the side entrance of the mill, the shift in atmosphere was instant. She wasn't dressed for television, no glitter, no glamour, just a deep navy suit, crisp white blouse, and a small flag pin over her heart. The heels clicking softly against the concrete echoed more like footsteps through memory than fanfare. She paused for a moment near a rusted plaque that bore the names of workers lost in a boiler explosion decades ago. Her fingers brushed the edge, not for the cameras, which hadn't started yet, but as if acknowledging where she stood. This wasn't the White House press room. It was hallowed ground, built by labor, loss, and the unspoken code of responsibility. The crowd didn't rise when she entered. They weren't told to. Some looked up, most stayed seated, arms crossed, brows furrowed, not in defiance but in quiet judgment. That kind of audience doesn't give applause freely. They wait to see if you've earned it. Karoline met their gazes with a steady calm, her spine straight, her jaw set. There was no teleprompter, no friendly anchor easing her in, just men who had bled for pensions that never came, and women who had buried husbands with dust still under their nails. A younger aide tried to hand her a notepad, but she waved it off. What she had to say tonight couldn't be read. It had to be felt. She approached the podium slowly, nodding once at a Vietnam vet in the front row. He didn't smile, but he tipped his hat, just slightly. It was the only welcome she'd get, and it was enough. She was here not to defend a man or a party, but to carry the weight of an office that still meant something, or at least it used to. The silence cracked when Jimmy Kimmel stepped onto the platform, grinning like he was walking into a comedy club instead of a steelworkers' hall. Dressed in a sleek charcoal blazer and tie-less shirt, he brought with him a different kind of energy, one forged in the bright lights of Hollywood, not the dim furnaces of Milltown. Some in the crowd chuckled out of habit, others shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to laugh or listen. He glanced at the flag behind him, then smirked. "Nice place. Reminds me of my dad's garage, if my dad built tanks for a living." A few in the audience chuckled, but it was forced. Kimmel wasn't here to read the room, he was here to control it. "So," he began, pacing lightly in front of the podium, "I checked Truth Social this morning. Trump posted at 3 a.m. again. Must be tariff time or tantrum time, depending on how many burgers were involved. Laughter came easier this time, from a younger pocket in the back. Up front, folded arms stayed folded. Then came the first direct hit. And tonight we've got Karoline Leavitt, the voice of the White House. Trump's press secretary and maybe the only person in D.C. who still thinks Melania lives there. Give her a hand, folks. Sarcastic applause rippled through the room, but the steelworkers weren't clapping. Karoline, standing still at her podium, didn't blink. She just watched him, like a welder sizing up an unstable beam, knowing it could collapse if the wrong pressure point was hit. Jimmy wasn't done. "Karoline," he said, flashing that trademark grin, "you've got a hard job. Defending a guy who tweets war plans to the wrong group chat and sends his wife a burger instead of roses. That takes guts." Or denial. More laughter now, louder this time, but something in the air shifted. Karoline's fingers curled slightly around the edge of the lectern. She didn't raise her voice, didn't flinch, just waited. Because in Milltown, jokes might land, but they don't linger. Not when real people are watching, not when truth is about to answer. Jimmy Kimmel didn't hesitate to go personal. With his smile sharpened into a blade, he leaned forward, speaking not just to Karoline, but to the crowd, testing their appetite for mockery. "So, Karoline," he said, "Trump's calling these tariffs Liberation Day, right? Liberating what exactly? Because word is, Melania liberated herself last week." Laughter burst from the back rows, but up front, where the older men sat with arms crossed and brows knit, the joke didn't land. Jimmy pushed further, smirking. "I mean, if roses are out and burgers are in, maybe she left because Ronald McDonald was getting more love than she was." The laughter swelled again, but this time something in the room shifted, a murmur of discomfort, a pause that wasn't quite silence, but something heavier. Karoline's expression didn't flicker. She let the wave of laughter roll and die on its own, then stepped toward the mic. Her voice, when it came, was firm and unshaken. "You think loyalty is a punchline," she said, eyes locked on Jimmy, "but in my world it's a foundation." She turned slightly to face the crowd. "You mock the president's marriage like it's a sitcom subplot, but let me tell you something. Families aren't your material. They're our lives." There was a stillness that followed, not dramatic, not rehearsed, just the quiet realization that she wasn't going to play the same game. "You can drag names into the dirt all you want," she continued, "but the people in this room know what it means to stand by someone when it's not easy, when it's inconvenient, when it's mocked." She didn't need to say more. A few of the older men exchanged glances. One nodded. Just once. Jimmy tried to cut in with another quip, but it missed the mark. Karoline had turned the room, if not to her side, then away from his. Because in a place where loyalty still means something, even the sharpest joke can fall flat if it crosses the wrong line. The air in the mill felt heavier as the laughter faded. Karoline didn't step back. Instead, she gripped the podium with purpose and let the silence hang before speaking, not to Jimmy, but to the crowd. "You want to know what Liberation Day really means?" she said, her voice low but steady. "It means a father clocking in again after months of silence at the kitchen table. It means a mother who doesn't have to choose between a doctor visit and the electric bill." Her tone wasn't defensive anymore, it was declarative. She wasn't reacting to Jimmy, she was reclaiming the floor. She reached into her blazer and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "This is a contract," she said. "It's from a steel supplier in Ohio that's hiring 50 new workers because of the new tariffs. 50 jobs. 50 families. 50 reasons I don't laugh when someone mocks the policies that made it happen." A few claps rose from the center of the audience. Not wild applause, but the kind of grounded approval that said, "She's not just talking, she gets it." Jimmy leaned back, visibly recalibrating. "And what about the rising prices, Karoline?" he asked, voice casual. "Burger inflation's real, isn't it?" Some in the crowd chuckled, but Karoline didn't flinch. "Inflation?" she repeated, eyes narrowed. "You think these people don't feel it every day? They don't need jokes. They need someone fighting to bring the supply chain back home, to stop pretending the solution is another stimulus check or another soundbite." She gestured around the hall. These walls didn't rise because someone posted a meme. They rose because people sweated, bled, and believed in work. She turned back to the crowd. You know what it's like to watch your town get hollowed out, to see your kids leave because there's nothing left here. We're bringing something back, not just jobs, but pride. That word pride seemed to echo through the rafters. A few men straightened in their seats. One man, middle-aged, wearing a local 191 cap, muttered, "Damn right." Karoline caught it and let it hang. "This isn't politics," she said finally, her voice softening. "It's personal. I'm not here to score points. I'm here because I've walked through towns like this and seen what was taken, and I will not apologize for fighting to bring it back." The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was real, and it was hers. Jimmy had jokes, Karoline had steel. The applause faded, but Karoline didn't retreat. Instead, she took a breath and let her hand fall to her side, fingers brushing the edge of the podium like it was an anchor. Her voice lowered, not for drama, but for something more intimate. 9 months ago, I gave birth to my first child, she began. The room stilled. Even Jimmy, who had been preparing another punchline, looked up. 4 days later, I was back in the West Wing, briefing the president, writing statements, answering calls at 2 in the morning. She paused, not for sympathy, but for truth. I wasn't there because I had to be. I was there because I believe in the mission. There was a murmur in the crowd. Respectful, reflective. Some of the older men exchanged glances, the kind that come when a story hits too close to home. You talk about loyalty like it's something to laugh at, she continued, but to me, it's sacrifice. It's missing first steps and sleepless nights so that I can fight for a future where my child won't have to grow up in a country that's been gutted and mocked from the inside out. Jimmy leaned forward slightly, the grin on his face softening. Karoline pressed on. I've stood in rooms where the pressure could crush you. I've sat across from world leaders and watched how one wrong word could change the fate of thousands. And yet I'm still here. Not because it's easy, but because it matters. Her voice wavered for just a moment, just enough to remind the room that conviction isn't built from ambition, but from cost. You want to talk about who we're fighting for? She asked, turning back to the crowd. We're fighting for the kid whose dad doesn't have to leave home to find work, for the mother who doesn't have to choose between feeding her family and heating her home. No applause came immediately, just silence, thick and honest. And in that stillness, Karoline Leavitt didn't look like a press secretary or a political figure. She looked like a mother, a fighter. And for a room full of men who knew what sacrifice meant, that was something they could respect. Jimmy straightened, sensing the mood had shifted. He forced a smile, hoping to pull the crowd back with humor. Look, Karoline, he said, I tell jokes. It's how I deal with the insanity. Satire's been part of American democracy since Ben Franklin drew cartoons. I'm not the enemy. I'm the mirror. There were a few soft laughs, but most faces remained unmoved. Karoline's expression didn't harden, it focused. You're not a mirror, she replied calmly. You're a filter. You choose what's funny, what's cruel, what's exaggerated, and most importantly, who's the punchline. She stepped forward again, her heels echoing on the old mill floor. And you don't just mock the powerful, she continued. You mock the people who believe in something. The man who puts his flag up every morning, the family who prays before dinner, the mom who names her son after her grandfather who served in Korea. You don't see them, but they see you, and they're tired of being ridiculed for loving their country. Jimmy tried to respond, but Karoline didn't yield the floor. You talk about power, but you sit behind a desk in LA and make millions tearing down people you'll never meet. I sit across from men and women who have lost everything, jobs, homes, sometimes hope. And I don't mock them. I listen. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was unmistakably clear. Because public service isn't a sketch, it's sacrifice, it's serious, and it deserves more than a laugh track. A murmur passed through the audience. One older man near the back nodded slowly, his arms still folded, but his eyes softening. Karoline held her gaze steady. You think it's brave to make fun of a president. I think it's brave to stand up when the world tells you to sit down. You've built a career making fun of things. I've built a life defending what matters. There was no applause, not yet, But for the first time all night, Jimmy had no comeback. The studio lights didn't feel warm anymore, and the crowd, especially the men who had known service, known risk, were no longer laughing. They were listening. Jimmy saw an opening and took it, seizing on what he hoped would tip the room back in his favor. "All right, Karoline," he said, leaning against the podium with a half-smile. "You talk about service and sacrifice, but explain this. How does a White House accidentally send war plans to a reporter? Was that a new strategy? Fast food diplomacy?" Laughter rippled from the back rows again, but it felt thinner now, forced. The front rows stayed quiet, eyes locked on Karoline, waiting to see if this was the moment she'd flinch. But she didn't. Karoline took a slow breath, nodded once as if she'd expected the jab, and answered with clarity. "Mistakes happen, in any administration. But what we don't do is weaponize human error for late-night ratings." Her tone didn't rise, but it hit harder than any shout. "And while you're busy turning national security into a punchline, our team is working, through the night every night, to fix the cracks, not laugh at them." Jimmy tried to cut back in, no denial, but Karoline stood firm. "I'm not here to dodge," she said. "I'm here to remind people what matters. When you mock what's serious, you don't hurt the president. You hurt the trust this country still wants to believe in." A murmur of agreement swept through the audience, subtle but present. Karoline looked around, locking eyes with a man in a steelworker's cap who gave her a quiet nod. "You can keep laughing, Jimmy," she said, voice even, "but these people don't need more jokes. They need someone who still takes the job seriously." And in that moment she wasn't defending a scandal, she was defending something deeper, the idea that not everything is a stage. Jimmy, sensing the room slipping further from his grip, pivoted back to mockery with a cultural edge. "So, I hear President Trump wants to host the Kennedy Center Honors," he said, smirking, "because nothing says love for the arts like cheeseburgers and Andrew Lloyd Webber, right?" Laughter followed, though softer than before. Karoline didn't smile. She took a step forward, her voice steady and low. "You think honoring American culture is about Broadway lights and champagne receptions, but to us, real culture is forged in places like this." She gestured to the steel beams overhead. "In sweat, in sacrifice, in the songs sung between shifts, and the values passed down across kitchen tables." The room quieted again, the weight of her words settling over the rows of folding chairs. "You laugh at the idea of this president recognizing American artists," she continued, "but maybe it's time we ask why patriotism has become something to mock." She looked directly at Jimmy. "You want to honor culture? Let's start with the families who've never missed a flag ceremony, who still recite the pledge, who hang their grandfather's medals above the fireplace. Not to be trendy, but because it means something." A few heads nodded now. Older men, veterans, churchgoers who'd long felt their version of America was being erased or ridiculed. Karoline took one last breath before finishing. "We don't hate art. We just believe the people who built this country deserve to be celebrated too. Not just the ones who perform on stages, but the ones who kept the lights on for them." There was no applause, just the kind of stillness that spoke louder than clapping. In that moment, patriotism wasn't red hats or red carpets, it was the rusted steel and the pride still burning in the hearts of men who remembered what it meant to build something that lasts. Jimmy leaned in, eyes glinting with one last shot. "Karoline, if President Trump is so strong, so hands-on, why are you here taking the heat? Shouldn't he be the one defending himself?" The question was sharp, meant to land like a dagger. The audience stirred, curious, waiting. But Karoline didn't flinch. She stepped forward, calm as ever, and answered not with fire, but with steel. Because real strength isn't about showing up to silence critics. It's about knowing who you trust to speak when the stakes are highest. Her voice dropped slightly, slow and deliberate. "President Trump doesn't send me because he's hiding. He sends me because I've earned it. Because he knows I won't fold under pressure. Because I believe in the mission just as much as he does." She turned to the crowd, letting the words settle. "Loyalty isn't weakness. It's knowing when to fight and when to represent something bigger than yourself." Jimmy tried to smirk, but the edge had dulled. Karoline finished the thought, eyes steady. You sit behind a desk with punchlines. I stand in front of real people with real problems. That's the difference. You want a spectacle. I came here with substance. The silence afterward wasn't awkward. It was charged. Even those who didn't agree with her politically could feel the conviction. One man in the third row, arms crossed for most of the night, uncrossed them. Karoline hadn't just answered the question, she'd turned it into a statement of strength. And in that moment, Jimmy's final jab had missed. Because, in a room built by labor and loyalty, trust wasn't given to the loudest. It belonged to the one still standing when the noise died down. The air inside the mill was still charged as Karoline stepped back from the podium. She didn't look shaken, didn't search the crowd for approval. She just stood there, letting the silence do what applause never could. Jimmy shifted at his desk, drumming his fingers, trying to reclaim the moment with a closing quip. But for once, he held back. The weight of what had just happened wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Karoline turned slowly to face the audience, her final words not rehearsed, but resolute. You've heard the jokes, you've seen the smirks, but what matters isn't what's said under studio lights, it's what gets done when no one's watching. President Trump is out there fighting to bring your jobs back. I came here to remind you of that. And to tell you this, mockery doesn't move steel. Work does. Loyalty does. Purpose does. She paused, eyes sweeping across the rows of men who hadn't smiled all night but were now watching her with something else in their eyes. Not agreement, necessarily, but respect. She offered a final nod to the Vietnam veteran in the front row, then turned and began to walk down the center aisle. No cameras followed, no handlers rushed behind her, just the echo of her footsteps against the concrete floor and the quiet murmur of a crowd still digesting what they'd witnessed. As the steel doors creaked open and she stepped into the cold Milltown night, no one cheered, no one chanted, but they remembered. Because Karoline Leavitt hadn't come to win laughs, she'd come to stand her ground. And in a place built by men who knew the weight of real work, that kind of strength spoke louder than any show ever could. The town hall emptied slowly, as if people weren't quite ready to return to their lives just yet. Outside, reporters clustered near the gates, shuffling to capture reactions. One local steel worker, gray-bearded and soft-spoken, summed it up best. I didn't come here for politics. I came to see if someone still remembers towns like ours. Tonight, I think she did. Online, however, the contrast was sharper. Within minutes, Truth Social lit up with all-caps praise from President Trump. Karoline is a warrior. She crushed Jimmy Kimmel. Total victory for America. The post spread like wildfire, accompanied by a photo of Karoline walking out of the mill, head high, jaw set. X, formerly Twitter, erupted in dueling hashtags. Steel-spined Karoline trended alongside burger debate as thousands debated whether she stood tall or folded under pressure. Commentators from both sides weighed in. Conservative voices hailed Karoline as the embodiment of principled strength, someone who didn't need to shout to command a room. Liberal pundits mocked the setting, calling it industrial theater. But for many older Americans watching at home, especially working-class men, the takeaway was simpler. Someone showed up, stood firm, and didn't blink. On talk radio the next morning, one caller said, "I don't agree with everything she said." But she didn't run from it, that counts for something. Jimmy Kimmel returned to his show the next night with a few prepared zingers, but the laughter felt thinner. Karoline, meanwhile, remained silent. No follow-up pressers, no social media blitz. Her silence said what words couldn't. She'd said her piece, and she'd done it on ground that mattered. In a divided country where so much feels staged, the steel mill showdown left something real behind. A reminder that conviction still cuts through the noise, if you're brave enough to bring it where it counts. In the end, the debate wasn't about punchlines or policy points. It was about identity, not just Karoline Leavitt's or Jimmy Kimmel's, but America's. The mill had seen its share of heat over the years, but what burned that night wasn't steel. It was truth rubbing up against performance. Karoline didn't come with charisma or charm. She came with weight, of office, of sacrifice, of the millions she believed she spoke for. And when the lights dimmed, She didn't linger for applause. She didn't need to. She had carried something older than politics into that room, a belief that service still means something, that conviction still matters, even when the cameras are rolling and the crowd is divided. For the men who watched from their living rooms, with calloused hands and long memories, for the ones who had been told they were forgotten, her presence said otherwise. In a culture obsessed with tearing down, Karoline stood up, not to win a headline but to hold a line. That's what resonated. Not perfection, not politics. Presence. The kind that doesn't vanish when the jokes fade. So what kind of country are we? Are we one that laughs louder than it listens? Or are we still capable of recognizing courage, not the kind made for TV, but the kind made for moments that require grit and grace? That night in Milltown didn't solve anything, but it reminded a fractured nation of the question that matters most. Not who's right or wrong, but who's willing to stand and speak when it's easier to sit and sneer. Karoline did, and whether you agreed with her or not, you remembered her. And in this age of distraction, that may be the rarest form of victory we still have left. The story of Karoline Leavitt at the Milltown Town Hall teaches a powerful lesson about conviction in an age of performance. In a world saturated with satire, soundbites, and social media spin, real strength often comes not from outshouting your opponent, but from standing firm when it would be easier to walk away. Karoline didn't fight with fury, she fought with composure, with values rooted in service, loyalty, and belief in the people she represented. Her silence between the punches, her grace under ridicule, spoke louder than any comeback. For older Americans, especially those who've worked, sacrificed, and watched their communities change, her message hit home. Not everything is a joke, and not every truth needs a laugh track to be valid. In a culture that rewards mockery, she showed the dignity of restraint. And while Jimmy Kimmel won laughs, it was Karoline who earned respect. The lesson? In divided times, it's not always about winning arguments. It's about standing for something real. Americans still respond to sincerity, especially when it shows up where it's least expected. And sometimes, the quietest voice in the room is the one history remembers most.